Good afternoon or morning or evening or whenever you're viewing this PowerPoint. My name is Juliana O'Neill and I'm going to be giving you guys a PowerPoint presentation on the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Alright, so who were these guys? Who were Sapir and Whorf? You had Edward Sapir and Benjamin Lee Whorf, who were both considered to be amazing American linguists. Whorf was actually Sapir's student, and while Sapir was primarily a linguist for most of his life, Whorf was a chemical engineer by training, and he was a fire prevention engineer by vocation, and then a linguist by avocation. Now, Sapir acknowledged the close relationship between language and culture. He maintained that they were inextricably related, so that you couldn't understand or appreciate the one without a knowledge of the other. Now, you had Whorf, who took up Sapir's ideas, but went much further than saying that there was merely a predisposition. In Whorf's view, the relationship between language and culture was a deterministic one. The social categories we create and how we perceive events and actions are constrained by the language we speak. Different speakers will then, because of that, experience the world differently, insofar as the language they speak differs structurally. The branch of linguistics that the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis comes from is the branch of sociolinguistics. Sociolinguistics is a term that includes the aspects of linguistics applied toward the connections between language and society and the way we use it in different social situations. It ranged from the study of the wide variety of dialects across a given region down to the analysis between the way men and women speak to one another. Sociolinguistics often shows us the humorous realities of human speech and how a dialect of a given language can often describe the age, sex, and social class of the speaker. It codes the social function of a language. Now, we've learned a lot through this class about the technical side of linguistics, whether it was from semantics to phonology and morphology, but sociolinguistics describes the cultural factors that influence our choice in these technical areas, and that's what the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis goes into. Is my language going to affect I see the world, and if it is that way, how do I deal with that? All right, to get started, the first question we're going to ask is, what is the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis? The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis holds that the structure of a language affects its speaker's worldview or cognition. In other words, it's stating that your language affects the way you see reality. And this hypothesis can also be known as Whorfianism, linguistic determinism, linguistic relativity, things of that nature. The principle of this hypothesis can be broken down into two versions. You have a strong version and a weak version. Now, that's not saying one version is more well thought out or that it has more things to back it. It's just saying that the stronger version is more dogmatic. It's much more rigid in what it's saying versus the weak version. Now, the strong version says that language determines thought and that linguistic categories limit and determine cognitive categories. Whereas when you're looking at the weak version, it says that linguistic categories in usage only influence thought and decision. Now, to break that down even more, linguistic determinism is the view that your language is a filter that determines the way you see reality. Now, the weaker view, which is linguistic relativity, this has been stated in many ways, but in general, it states that language influences thought, or that different language communities see the world differently. The strong version of the hypothesis, linguistic determinism, is often called the prison house view of language. That means that the limit of language are the limits of the world. This implication is that if a linguistic sign is not available for a particular concept, that concept is difficult or impossible for the speaker to imagine. But as we've seen, language allows us to create new meanings, whether these are words for new objects or items. If the strong version of linguistic determinism were correct, it would almost be impossible for us to do this. As a result, linguistic determinism is often not a widely held view. All right, we've just finished discussing linguistic determinism, and now we're going to talk about linguistic relativism. Now, this is the version of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis that seems more plausible to many. It's simply because it's less confining than the deterministic view. It suggests that language influences the way we think, which then brings up a question, that is, if the connection between language and thought is not absolute, and determinism would have it say that it is absolute, then how far does it go? It might be helpful to think of linguistic relativism as relating to how language influences the way we normally think rather than language determining the way we think. In conclusion, there's definitely a connection between someone's language and their worldview. But how deep that connection is still debated. The jury's still out on the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis for many, and the truth of it may depend entirely on how strong a view that you're arguing for or against the ideas of linguistic relativity, linguistic determinism, or anything in between. The fact that people are still unsure of how heavily Whorf argued for this idea makes people unsure of the hypothesis, and that can be seen as problematic. But overall, I think many can agree that there is a connection, but on how deep that is up to the person, I suppose. All right, guys, thanks for listening to me for the past 5 to 10 minutes. Appreciate you taking your time to click on my PowerPoint, and I hope you have a great day.